So we're back, and I want to talk about one strength and one weakness in the Tide article. Um, let's talk first about a potential weakness, and this may be my own perception, rooted in how I write. Um, you know, we talked about the thesis, and we talked about perhaps the intended audience, or what I contend may in fact be evidence of the audience to whom Tida is primarily directing his statements. But then we move right from thesis. I think it's probably pretty easy to say that it's in one of those last two paragraphs before number one, on the second page, that is page 24 of the article. The second page is, if you've got it copied off, right, page 24 in terms of the numeration. It goes right from one to the other, and I tend to like it. I think it tends to help the reader when we say, this is what I'm going to do, first, second, third, and so on. So Tida doesn't do that. It's not so much a logical weakness, but I think it would help the reader know where he's going. For example, if the second of the two thesis statements that I suggested, God's way of ruling sets a new standard and yields evangelical wisdom concerning the legitimate court exercise of power, then to go right to number one, neither Jesus nor the evangelist denied the reality of power, so forth and so on. That kind of hits me cold, right? I didn't know where he was going next. I mean, I could have surmised from the title, right, and the colon, what comes after the colon, that he's going to be looking at Luke 22:24 to 30, but there's not a kind of programmatic statement. This is how I'm going to proceed, and maybe it's my own weakness in terms of how I like to read, but I like to know where a writer's going. Now, what he says makes sense to me, but it hits me a little cold. So that may be kind of an organizational weakness. Now, obviously, what I've said there is something that doesn't give too much away, right? So I'm looking for you, students, to think through some other kinds of logical or resourced or substantive kinds of weaknesses in his argument. There's one. Organizationally, I say, oh, this might be a problem because it makes it more difficult for the reader to follow. Notice then, going back to whether an article is easy to read or not, this is rooted in something that we can point to that's not so subjective, right? He doesn't give that kind of programmatic statement, ergo that could be perceived as an organizational weakness, and that's something that you feel free to do, to identify what kind of weakness this is. It may be organizational, it may be structural, it may be on the argument, it may be the resources, it may be any number of things. All right, so feel free, if it helps, label it. This is an organizational challenge that could be overcome. So on strengths, pardon me. One of the things that I think Tida does very well is he incorporates literature and thinkers from outside of his own discipline. He starts with Patrick Dolan and Max De Pree on the first page. He talks about Pilate, and of course the Sanhedrin, and any number of things related to good biblical history, and he's attentive to what's gone on in Rome and the Hellenistic world, the Greek world. As I go on here, and I notice that he not only pays attention to secular history, not only to the popular culture and writers now, but he also pays attention to church history. This is on page 27 of the article, which I believe is the fifth page. Under number 3, I confer on you a kingdom. He's got a nice quote here from Archbishop Rembert George Weakland of Milwaukee, a Catholic bishop, and gives some attention to church history and the rule of Saint Benedict from, I believe, the 7th century after Christ. And then finally, he turns back to U.S. history from the 1970s, talking about George Kennan and his debate with Henry Kissinger, who was Secretary of State in the second Nixon administration and was National Security Advisor in the first. I think the writer here does a really good job of blending both biblical history, geopolitical history, more recently and in the ancient past. I think he brings a lot of resources. He has a good way of maneuvering through disparate kinds of resources and bringing them into a whole to help make his point. So that seemed to me to be a really good strategy, especially for a publication like Word and World. It seemed to, it's rooted in biblical studies, but it's not solely dependent on biblical studies as a source for Titus thinking. So I thought that was a strength that could be capitalized on. So we'll come back and we will talk a little bit about critique.